Hi, my name is Gloria Kohlmann, and I am a chalk artist. And the name of this picture is God's Special Surprise. It is actually a very surprising picture even to me because I had to research to do the various elements of the picture. I'm shading for the undertones of the plants and flowers that will be drawn. I also had to look up about Egypt because this picture takes place near the Nile in Egypt. The story of Moses is a very ancient story. It's a true story, and I had to be very correct in my rendition of the plants so that it would look like they were really at an African riverbank. I'm actually drawing papaya plants there. They have a very lacy look if you were to see them, a picture of them. And most of the plants that you are going to be seeing me draw are drawn on top of darker colors. When I do a darker color first, that means I'm creating the shadow, so I'm not having to draw in between the plants. I draw on top of the deeper colors with the stronger colors and also stronger strokes, like I'm doing the reeds here. This picture was actually not only challenging, but it was a lot of fun. I enjoyed doing the plants for a change. I usually do landscapes that have these sweeping motions, but this had a lot of repetitive motion, and I had to make sure that I had my colors correct. Some of the plants would end up in the sunlight, and some of them would end up in the shade. In the middle, you see an area there that looks like water. If you read in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in Exodus, you'll read the story of Moses, baby Moses, and how he ended up in a basket in the middle of the river. The Israelites were in captivity and slaves of the Egyptians. And if you remember anything about the Pharaoh, this man did not want to let these people go back to their homeland. And he was always creating incredible problems, and they were good slaves because they worked hard. And if you're familiar with the pyramids, they were all built by the slaves of Egypt. At that time, the Israelites were getting very, very plenteous. They were growing in multitude, they were growing in strength, and many of them were showing leadership qualities. And so Pharaoh decided he wanted to annihilate and literally destroy perhaps a whole generation of male babies. So what he did was he ordered all of the Israelite male children to be killed. So the soldiers were going through and literally massacring these children. And if you remember, in the time of Jesus, there was a massacre that was ordered too by Herod because he was afraid that he was going to be dethroned by this king that he was hearing about. So this is sort of a parallel story in the sense that these children were being massacred. So the mother of Moses told her daughter Miriam, who is Moses' sister, to take him down to the Nile riverbanks and hide him in the reeds. Again, if you look on the computer and look at these images of these different plants, the reeds are actually very thick, and you could hide something there. You know, in the Nile, it's very, very dangerous. There are crocodiles. There are all kinds of different animals in that area that are predatory for humans. So Miriam took the son down there by faith, and she hid in the bushes. You'll be seeing Miriam drawn over on the right in a minute. And Moses was hid in the bushes there, in the reeds. Actually, in the picture here, we've got a clearing, so you can actually, see Moses in the basket. But he was hid right there in the reeds. And the Egyptian princess and her attendants would come down to the Nile to bathe. They would go swimming like you and I would go up in a mountain stream. This is what they did. It's one of their recreations. And it was hot. So they would go down to the riverbanks and they would swim and bathe. Perhaps Moses' mothers knew that they would come down there, and perhaps she knew that someone would see the baby and perhaps protect him. She had no idea. She was just going on pure faith. So here Moses was in the basket out there in the water, and here came the princess and her attendant. And they said, "Look, there's a baby in the water." And I believe the scripture says that the princess's heart was softened. She couldn't have any children, and so she always wanted a child, so I think she believed that this was miraculous. So her attendant went into the water and took Moses out of the water. Did you know that Moses' name means drawn from the waters? That's what his name means. So they took Moses, and he became a prince in the home of the king, the Pharaoh himself. He was raised in the palace. He was trained as a warrior. He was trained and educated, so he became a very educated man, which never would have happened to the extent that it did had he been in the Israeli home. The other miraculous thing that happened was that the princess needed a nurse for the baby. She had not had any children. She could not nurse. What happened was that Moses' mother, by a divine providence, ended up being her own son's nurse. So she actually went into the palace, and that was her job, was to be her son's nurse. So who knew the conversation that she had with her son? Moses grew up, and one day, as you know from the scriptures, delivered all of Israel from the hand of Pharaoh miraculously. Moses ended up leaving Pharaoh's house because he had become angry at an Egyptian soldier for killing an Israelite. He ended up going into exile, marrying Zipporah, his wife, down in the south of Africa, and becoming literally a sheep farmer. And that was where God began to teach him and train him personally through his experiences in the desert. And it wasn't until he was about 80 years old that he began to deliver Israel, and they began to come out of Egypt. It's a very great story. I encourage you to read it in Exodus. What I'm doing here, you see, I'm beginning to draw the basket for baby Moses. I had to make the chalk thinner in that place because I was going to be adding a little more detail than I would in other places. The wreaths that you see behind the basket create another special surprise imagery. I had an exceptionally challenging time with this picture, but I also had a very rewarding time. We all have times of needing the Red Sea to part. And this was a time in my life when I had to have a lot of faith. And I have to tell you, as I'm sitting here right now, that God did part my waters, and He blessed me. And He is still the God that parts the waters in your life. Whether you needed that extra job or you needed anything in your life, He parts the waters, whether it's the little waters or big waters. We're living in a time right now where we have to have a lot of faith. And this story is very meaningful for all of us. A lot of the toning that is done ahead of time in this picture, the water and the reeds, is different than other pictures that I've done. Other pictures you cannot see much imagery at all, but this one I had to because of the length of time that it would take to draw this picture in a timely fashion. It's actually very difficult to draw with a huge piece of chalk, as you saw there, those smaller lines. And sometimes I use a small piece of chalk, but a lot of times I get so involved in what I'm doing, I take the nearest piece of chalk and just keep drawing. It is a very spiritual experience for me to do this kind of art, because the art is not being done to hang on a wall. It's done to reach others for the sake of the gospel and the stories of the Bible that perhaps people have never read or don't have time to read. Another very important factor about this picture is the colors. I started with the usual purple toning before I even came to the studio. Usually it's there and I draw on top of it, but this time I drew on top of it before I came to the studio with the water shading and the reeds that you see above the basket there. The reeds are done with a lot of the same colors that are present near the African Nile there in Egypt. The bright yellow greens and the dark colors for shading. Here I'm using a marking pencil, like a colored pencil, to get some delineation so it's not quite so fuzzy and it can be seen a little bit easier. The baby out there looks like he's having a real nice time out there in the sun and the water floating around. Hopefully he didn't have to be out there too long. We don't know really how long he was out there. I think all mothers get worried about babies that need to eat and if they're crying and need to be changed, but so we don't really have those details. At this point in time, I'm going to begin the rendition of the princess and her attendant. I had to really pray about how I was going to do them, because the Israelites, of course, wore very plain attire with togas and tunics and very burlappy sort of cloth, a lot of cotton because they had to work in the heat. Whereas the Israelite royalty dressed in finery. I encourage you to do research online for some of this imagery, because you can learn a lot about their clothing and the history and what things looked like. I looked up what an Egyptian princess would look like, and they looked entirely different than I thought. I've seen a lot of movies, and I don't know if the movies were accurate, but the attire that you're going to see me draw here is the accurate attire. They actually had mirrors, and they had gold and bronze, and they were very wealthy. As you know, the pyramids are still standing. You can see some sort of a sketchy outline of pyramids up there at the top when you see a wide shot when the camera moves up. That is done on purpose. I had to conceal the invisible picture that you'll be seeing in a little while. I had to also create an environment that it was a river bank. It was a large challenge for me to conceal the invisible picture, but we managed through research and through prayer and being creative on how I could create this picture. The Egyptian princesses actually wore their hair braided in locks, as you see there. And they had a sort of a white, they may have been ivory teeth, I'm not sure, but they're ivory headbands that hung down around their faces kind of low. And of course, a lot of times they would have a snake image or a cobra, a golden cobra on the front of their headband, because that denoted that they were royalty. So they were coming down and just heading into the water. The princess is the one on the left, and she is asking her attendant, who is very, very afraid, actually, of going into the water because there could be alligators in there or those piranha fish that eat you alive. So, of course, the princess wouldn't go in the water, so she's sending the attendant, who is taking really her life in her hands, to go and retrieve the child. So there she goes, and she's holding on to her princess there. The princess and their attendants, they were very close. They usually grew up together. The attendants, they were like slaves, but they were very well cared for and very well fed and educated also. They were very close to their masters. They depended upon their masters, and they really were not trying to ever escape. The ones that were trying to escape were the Israelites, because they were not well treated as slaves. They were barely fed. They had to grow and feed themselves, and it was a very difficult life. But they flourished. In every situation in the scriptures, if you read about every time that the Israelites were in captivity from Babylon to Egypt, they always flourished as a people because they worshiped God, they observed their Sabbath, and they never forgot who God was. And when they did, God really dealt with them, and they always returned. Because I'm using these bright colors against a light color, I have to also outline the arms here against that lighter blue. You can see that the princess and her attendant are holding on to each other. The princess doesn't want to slip in the water, and the attendant doesn't want to go in the water. So she's headed over there. If you read the story, of course, she's successful, and they bring the baby back to the palace. The colors that you see in the front, the dark greens, I did the dark greens to help create a perspective for the lighter yellows and blues. So when you do see the wide shot there, it creates a perspective. The plants that are along the riverbank that go into the distance there also creates a perspective because it goes from large to small. And in chalk art, because you're working on a flat surface, the only thing that creates perspective is color and changing dimensions like this from small to large. You may have noticed the top part of the picture. Usually I have just a complete white cloud, and this time, because of the reveal, I could not have a white cloud, and I had to literally conceal the lines of the water, the parting waters, with the lines of the pyramids, and everything worked together. And here we have the parting of the Red Sea. The reeds become representation of the Israelites going across. Thank you for watching and experiencing Scripture come alive through chalk art on See the Light.